and I see Rembrandt every day. And isn't this the case that faith is a lifelong commitment, but a daily struggle?
Yeah.
And I see Rembrandt every day with that image that's in the museum, in the pilgrimage, of his right hand considering virtue and his left hand considering the things of the world, the gold chain, and the struggle that we all have to go through every day to stay on course.
Here we go. Welcome to a special edition of the Focusing Way podcast. I'm your host, David Battistella. We call these special editions The Way is Love. Find The Focusing Way on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and our website, thefocusingway.com. The idea of being a pilgrim still fascinates me. I like to arrive at unknown places with an empty mind and to have it filled with the knowledge the place and the surroundings have to offer. Being a pilgrim, to me, is arriving humbly and hungry and walking away satisfied and enriched. That is how I felt after reading Pilgrimage to the Museum. It's no secret that the Met in New York City is a must-see museum for anyone who wants to understand, study, or just experience art. My guest today, Stephen Auth, has created a unique pathway through that museum, giving a virtual tour in book form that leaves you in wonder and also enriched. His keen eye, detailed descriptions, and straightforward storytelling has you come away with lessons in art, history, theology, and at the same time touches the heart by relating complex history through the works found in the Met. Steve is a member of the Regnum Christi movement and sits on the national board of the Lumen Institute, which he helped found in New York with his wife, Evelyn. He has led the New York City Street Mission for 10 years. And joining me now is Stephen Auth. Stephen, welcome to the Way is Love podcast.
Thank you.
You've had a long career on Wall Street, and you could be seen by people as kind of a Wall Street guy. But how has faith played a role in how you've lived out your career?
Well, that's a very long story, but
Yeah.
the short of it, David, is that it's, I always tell, I give talks at business schools around the country because they're kind of, that maybe asking the question in a slightly more cynical way, which is how could possibly be that a Wall Street person could be a Catholic?
Right.
And the reality is that there are a lot of devout Catholics on Wall Street, and good-hearted Christians, and of course many of the Judaic faith that don't get so much publicity. But I have a talk I give about it's called Humility at the Highs, and it's really about how Christian values, in particular, make you actually more successful at Wall Street. If you have a long-term view.
Yeah.
On the short term, the Wolf of Wall Street method, ripping the eyeballs out of your clients, can sometimes make you a quick buck, but often land you in jail. But it certainly doesn't build long-term relationships. And, the whole concept of servant leadership, self-mastery, prudence, integrity, humility, these are things that actually make great investors and very good leaders.
Yeah.
So I would say that my faith has been one reason why I've been so successful for such a long time on Wall Street to this day.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you for that. The book is fascinating, and it sort of takes us from 5,000 years ago to the present day. But can you talk a little bit about how it evolves and how the tours you and your wife Evelyn were taking people through on the Met led to this volume?
Well, we've been here in New York, and given my lifelong interest in art, I studied art history, among other things, at Princeton University, many, many years ago. And my investment career took me all over the world. So obviously, I spent a lot of time in all the great art museums. We're talking about your hometown in Florence just a few minutes ago. And, that that lifelong interest always led to us giving our own little private tours of the Metropolitan to out of state guests, out of country guests who would come visit us in New York City. And frankly, we were given those tours very much the way the art history establishment would, which is in a kind of a scientific, clinical way, without even realizing what I was doing. But certainly, I don't want to be critical, but maybe trying to describe the art without mentioning God would be kind of where a lot of that is. And I had my own conversion experience, kind of a deeper one that is talked about a little bit in a previous book I wrote called The Missionary of Wall Street that you may have read. And that was about 20 years ago or so. And after that, I was standing in front of a painting in the Met called The Toilet of Bathsheba by Rembrandt with a Met docent. And she was very accurately describing this painting and, the beautiful Bathsheba, and it's one of Rembrandt's only nudes, painted during what they called his Oriental period, when he's fascinated with things in the Far East. His brushstrokes were sort of middle period Rembrandt. If you're an art history student, you would be able to identify that fairly quickly, et cetera. And it was all right, but having had this reconversion experience and kind of more attuned maybe to the presence of God, I realized, wait a second here. She's missing the entire point. This is not a painting of Bathsheba at all. This is a painting about David, who appears in the dark upper corner of the painting in the turret of the castle. And in fact, what I'm looking at here isn't really Bathsheba. It's the image of Bathsheba in David's mind as he takes the so-called, what a priest friend of mine likes to call the second look. He says, Steve, the first look's not your fault, the second look is, right?
Right.
So this is the second, maybe third and fourth look. And actually what Rembrandt is alluding to here, which all of his viewers back in, the Dutch Reformed Republic in the early 1637, the painting was painted, they would have instantly understood this is about the slippery slope of sin, right? And David is about to take that first step down the slippery slope. And, I came home from the museum that afternoon and told my wife, sweetheart, I've had a breakthrough here. We're looking at this art the wrong way. We gotta start with God, because after all, God is beauty.
Yeah.
And artists, their particular talent is describing beauty, i.e. describing God, and they're seeking the image of God within their own souls in some ways, even when they don't know it. So we kind of went at it with that assumption. I always tell people when they take the tour, all I ask for is an open heart. And we start with a quote from Ecclesiastes, 13:9, that I've imprinted the eternal in men's hearts, basically.
Yeah.
And without them even knowing what I've imprinted. And that's sort of the basis at which we go about the tour. And we start out in ancient Egypt 5,000 years ago, where men through art were seeking God. They were seeking the eternal. And, you could sit there and laugh at the Egyptians for mixing it all up and making themselves gods instead of, finding God.
Right.
Until you start to think about, well, when do I do that in my life? I make myself God. And the pilgrimage sort of proceeds on that basis. And what's really was fascinating, the more we started to do this is, of course, you see more and more every time you do it, and folks you take on and see things that you didn't see. But the number of themes and motifs in this struggle to find God that keep recurring over hundreds, even thousands of years, long past the time when these artists have since passed away, to heaven. you begin to realize, wait a second here, something else is at work here.
Yeah.
And, you kind of gradually get the idea that maybe this is about man seeking God, or maybe it's about God seeking us.
Yeah.
So it just becomes a very self-reflecting. I think the word pilgrimage, we used it for a reason. It becomes a pilgrimage. And this tour has become so popular, and we can only do it a few times a year, 6 or 7 maybe, Friday nights after the markets close. And my assistant keeps a list of people wanting to get on this thing.
Yeah.
There's only small groups, and people are saying to me, Steve, why don't you write it as a book so that you could share this with more people? And of course, a book is different than a tour, and it takes a lot of work. But COVID came along, and one of the silver linings of COVID for me was it disintegrated my weekend social schedule.
Yeah.
And I had time to do this. And so, that was kind of a fruit of COVID in some ways, bringing this tour, if you will, this pilgrimage to a broader audience. In this really beautiful book Sophia did.
Yeah. I mean, you just go through the volume and the descriptions on every image and the way we're being taken through, just right there the whole way. And I just, I'm just going to say this question. You don't have to answer it, but I might put it back in earlier where you answered it. But you opened the book with this striking experience that you had looking at a Rembrandt painting of Bathsheba. Can you describe that experience for me? Don't have to answer that right now. I'm going to put that back in up where you answered it. But one thing that struck me, we're going to get into a little talk about beauty, but I just want to ask you, what have you learned about God after looking at images, 5,000 years of art as you take this tour through the Met? What's it really taught you about God?
Well, the first, as I sort of alluded to it, is that he's seeking me. And, I think that's where you got to start to realize that he's seeking each and every one of us. I've learned that to find him, I need to make myself the little person, not the big person.
Yeah.
The need for humility, that's where you kind of find God. I know that when I leave my apartment in New York in the morning, I've got to make a conscious decision. Am I going to have the face of Trebonius Gallus, who's a figure that appears in the museum and in the pilgrimage? And, he's a guy that's got the worries of the world on his shoulders because he's doing it all himself and doesn't believe in God. So am I going to have his face on, the creased, worried brow? Or am I going to have the face of the Emperor Constantine on, who's also in pilgrimage, who is a man of God, and despite all his troubles, is calm and serene because he knows that God's got his back. And I think that's a conscious decision every day. I think of the image of Rembrandt. I call it Rembrandt's greatest self-portrait. It's actually, a docent would tell you that's not a self-portrait. That's Aristotle with a bust of Homer there. But it's a portrait of Rembrandt's soul and his greatest self-portrait. And I see Rembrandt every day. And isn't this the case that faith is a lifelong commitment, but a daily struggle?
Yeah.
And I see Rembrandt every day with that image that's in the museum, in the pilgrimage, of his right hand considering virtue and his left hand considering the things of the world, the gold chain, and the struggle that we all have to go through every day to stay on course. I see the image of Mary in Antonella de Messina's Virgin Annunciate, which was one of the advantages of the book form, by the way. I was able to sneak in some of my favorite paintings and sculptures from around the world, which, of course, you can't do in an evening at the museum. And one of them, David, is in your part of the world down there in Palermo, Italy. It's never only been out of the museum twice in its history. Once it came to the Met for a few weeks, and I was there. I saw it. But this wonderful image of the Annunciation scene in all its ambiguity. It's the only image I know of from that period that doesn't have the angel in it.
Yeah.
So Mary's alone in her room in the dark, and she's been preparing her heart, reading the Torah or maybe the Psalms, and you can see the pages fluttering in the breeze as the angel has just shown up in this young Jewish girl's bedroom. And you can see she's initially somewhat surprised, like all of us would be. Like, I've got a plan here. I'm about to get married. She clasps her blouse in modesty, and her right hand stands out. And I can imagine what my own would have been like in this situation. Full stop, no way. Not quite like that with Mary. She just sort of puts her hand out, and then she's curling it.
Yeah.
Listening. I don't know whether I would have had the courage to even listen. And how often do I not listen to the Lord in prayer and assume it was just a bad dream? But she's listening and considering. And what I really love, and the image that really sticks with me in the spiritual life, is not just Mary's ability to consider and listen to the word of God, but her ability to conform her will to his, taking on what looked like almost a suicide mission. I mean, let's face it, if Joseph denies her, she's getting stoned tomorrow morning in the village square.
Yeah.
And even if that doesn't happen, Herod is certainly going to be after her and the kid. And if she can get away from him, the Romans for sure are going to want his head. And the only escape route is a dangerous 500-mile trek across a desert to a foreign country. And yet she takes this on. And you can see the way Antonello de Messina paints this. And I call it the Catholic Mona Lisa. I'm not the only one who refers to this painting as the Catholic Mona Lisa. It was actually painted almost the same year as the Mona Lisa. It's those eyes and the lips as she looks out at you. And isn't this the issue with all of us in the spiritual life? Like, we even come to as far as agreeing with God that we're going to do something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we don't quite get it done.
Yeah.
And you look at Mary and the determination in her lips, like, you're going to put your money on this girl.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's that fiat. And not only that, you describe so beautifully how these artists manage to contemplate and capture a moment from a perspective and represent it to us in a way. And then that's only the hand of God working as well. Like that you, when you were first describing Bathsheba, that painting was painted by Rembrandt, but somehow it came together with you to move you in your life to do, to complete your mission, or to give you this moment so that it would bring you to this book and to these tours and to our conversation. And like, so it's just such an incredible opera that God is presenting for us. And in every one of these pieces, there's a thread of that, a thread of like what he wants to show us and what the love that he wants to give us, and how he wants to communicate with us through artists. And in this case, through some incredible images. And I guess as you go through the book, it really sort of takes you up to the modern day. And as we get to the modern day, we sort of see what I kind of feel is like the disorder that has entered into the human experience, right? From a even let's say from a Thomistic point of view, like you can just feel the disorder coming into the world with the way the paintings and the way the painters are depicting it, and the story that God is telling us through them now. And I'm just, so you talk about beauty, I'd like to ask you a couple questions on beauty. And one is, how do you define it? That's the first one.
Yeah. I don't think you can define it scientifically.
No.
Although I think art historians try to do that. I think it's sort of like the inverse of pornography. You know it when you see it. I mean,
Yeah.
it speaks to your soul. It describes the glory of God. It speaks to your soul. I think that's what it is. And, Evelyn is always, she's even more optimistic than I am. So it's a good combination.
Yeah.
And even when I'm, in my darkest moments, when I'm describing the death of God, in a kind of sarcastic way, frankly, obviously, but, in the way some of the artists actually believe that
Yeah.
after Nietzsche and the whole secularization of the culture and the rise of atheism. Um, even in attempting to paint something like God's tomb, right? So Monet paints this image of Rennes Cathedral, which I believe he was consciously or unconsciously painting it as the tomb of God.
Yeah.
The cathedral's dark. The stained glass windows are grayed out over. The doors are closed. There's nobody in the painting. He's even removed the sculptures from the facade of Rennes Cathedral. There's no
Yeah.
sign of life. But as Evelyn would point out, even in that darkness, there is light, right? It's
Sure.
shining off the stones of the cathedral. It's in the sky. God is present. The artist can't get rid of him. We
Yeah.
can't get rid of him. He's the hound of heaven. He's always chasing us.
Yeah.
The chaos too is as we spin into abstract expressionism and Picasso and all this stuff. There's a painting, and I bring this up because I know that you've seen the panel, because I've asked people about this, and a lot of them don't remember this panel. Well, let me start with there's a painting in the pilgrimage from Jackson Pollock, which is
Yeah.
post World War II. New York, becomes the center of the universe, and art kind of moves there. And Pollock takes up from Picasso in this direction of pure abstract art, and is famous for dripping paint onto the canvas. And a lot of people say, "Oh, I could have done that myself," and I always challenge them on that. I mean, this painting at the Met is called Autumn Rhythm, and there's this rhythm to the paint, and there's energy force that even an atheist like Pollock was fascinated with,
Yeah.
even though he doesn't know what that energy force is. Except by now, the artist is the creator. He's no longer seeking the creator. He's not trying to lift us up to the eternal. He's showing us his own dexterity with paint. He is now the creator, right? So we've killed off the creator and we're the creator. That usually doesn't work out well. Pollock himself, unfortunately, dies prematurely, drives his car into a tree after a drunken incident. But, I contrast the Pollock chaos of Autumn Rhythm. Right next to it is a panel from the Sistine Ceiling. It's a small panel, David, but I
Yeah.
think you're familiar with it. It's
Yeah.
God creating the earth. And, it's chaotic in a way. I mean, God is shown both coming in and going out. He's moving around. He's, high energy guy. And there's this swirl of chaos
Yeah.
up above that Michelangelo paints. But the difference between the chaos in that painting and the chaos in the Pollock is, in the case of the Pollock, the artist is at the center of it, and it's kind of a chaotic life, and the painting is chaos. But in the Michelangelo, there's the chaos, but God is pulling it into order and creating life out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and just as you bring that up, I just wanted to add my own Jackson Pollock experience here, because obviously I've seen those paintings. But very early in my time here in Florence, this goes to free will. This actually goes to free will, because very early in my time in Florence, there was a small show of Jackson Pollock's sketches from Florence. So, and these were technically perfect. I mean, this man was not void of artistic skill. I mean, they were
Exactly.
technically perfect drawings. But that means, a free will choice was made by that artist at some time to sort of break things wide open, or not look at the world, not choose to look at the world in that way, and produce that, right? That kind of chaotic thing. But then the contrast that brings to what you described right beside a Michelangelo panel also is kind of something we're living with in our modern world, right? And the image, a photograph, a single image, I mean, it's so over consumed in our culture, it's almost become meaningless, or at least ignored to a degree. But what I love about your book is that you revisit the same images, and you start to fall into the amount of contemplation that the artist put into the work. But what have you found by like revisiting these single images in art history and the story they tell, and how that story changes?
Yeah, I find, and I think maybe this is in some ways, it's maybe the way I write or the way I reflect before I write. But to be fair, there's something in this book that's a little bit autobiographical. In some ways, it's a personal journey. You can see me struggling with these same struggles that, this Wall Street guy maybe with what these artists have struggled with. And I actually think for a lot of readers, it's what makes it interesting, because I think all of us in some ways are struggling to find our creator, and yeah, it is very personal for me, David.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many times where I felt that reading the book, and where we're sort of coming back, and not only that, the threads of life that join together in these works that you've experienced also comes through very clearly. But one thing that I think does come through across the centuries is the story that artists are telling has changed in a way, or at least, like you were alluding to with Jackson Pollock, the point of view that they want to take on telling that has changed, where it goes kind of from a reverence. I even describe this to people now about when I first took photographs when I came to Italy the very first time. My camera was always pointed outward to the world, and then I would go home and show all those photographs of these places that I've seen. And just over the course of my life, that camera has done a 180-degree turn. And the people put themselves in front of everything that I had photographed. So if I had come to Florence to photograph the cathedral, which was the subject of the photograph, the person has become the subject of every photograph. Yeah. And what I was using as a subject has become background fodder in this world that we're in now. It's like an inversion. And that inversion seems to occur also in this book, where we go from this great beauty, ordered sort of art in a classical Christian sense, to kind of a disorder, but it's also recounting our history in a way. That had a big effect on me. Can you talk about that experience a bit?
Yeah. Initially I was a little bit concerned about that, because I spent so much time. I mean, there's 3 chapters at the end of the book in the modern period, and there's a lot of art from that period that we use. And I struggle with, it's a darker time in some ways,
Yeah.
and do you want to spend that much time here? But to me, it's the darkness that we're all stumbling through, and that's what makes it more interesting. And what I found, the more I've meditated on these paintings and sculptures from this period that we're in now, in a way, you see that even in their darkest moments, artists are seeking God, and some of them actually come back to Him,
Yeah.
which is really fascinating. As the deeper they dive, there's these images. After we've killed God off, conveniently. Well, it turns out, isn't it the case, and this is a big theme of the first book I wrote, Missionary Wall Street, that the dream of a godless life doesn't usually work out nearly as well as people think. And sooner or later, sooner usually, it gets kind of messy.
Yeah.
And the artists begin to recognize that. You see that in the works of Seurat as an example, or even Van Gogh, who kind of goes crazy. These images of loneliness that begin to emerge. Of course, without God, it becomes very lonely, right?
Yeah.
And Hopper, and in that darkness, the artists are stumbling forward. I mean, a guy, Mark Rothko. Until I really studied Rothko, I thought, well, here's just another one of these guys with these blocks of
Yeah. Yeah.
thing. And he's trying to portray some sort of energy force out there. So he was a believer in a sense, and I didn't know this until I really researched it, but Rothko actually spent the last 7 years of his life building and painting the walls of, or paintings for, mostly they're not murals, they're actually paintings that are hung, a Catholic church
Wow.
in Mexico.
Wow.
Became known as the Rothko Chapel. It exists to this day. It's no longer a Catholic church, but um, I think sometimes the process for these very introspective, I mean, these are folks whose particular talent is to describe God in some ways, right?
Yeah.
And they almost can't help themselves but by drawn back to him, even when everything around them is telling them not to. I mean, the book ends with this wonderful image of Christ on the hypercube by Salvador Dali, who was raised as a devout atheist. I mean, his father was,
Yeah.
a devout atheist. His mother was a Catholic. But sooner or later, Dali finds his way back home
Yeah.
and creates this beautiful image. And I think Dali understood that for the modern people don't really understand the cross. I mean, even Catholics,
Yeah.
they're like, oh, this is a kind of a messy thing. Like, let's stick with the Beatitudes kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And they don't understand the role of the cross completely in it as an instrument of victory, not defeat. The folks in the Renaissance and Middle Ages did. So, but interesting today, by the way, if you watch the Sotheby's art auctions, which I do, even great master crucifixion paintings typically struggle to be sold at fair prices because they're just not that popular. But
Yeah.
this image that Dali paints is Christ on the cross. He's using a hypercube, which is also very interesting because it's a kind of scientific explanation of God. This idea of the fourth dimension, which I've checked with some Catholic scholars, and they've told me, look, Steve, it's not, I don't want to heresy in the book, but, the church hasn't opined on this concept. God could be maybe that is where God exists in the fourth dimension. We don't know. But that's sort of a side point. The thing that he paints here is Christ on the hypercube, this terrasac or fourth dimension. But what's wonderful about it is it's Christ untortured. He's got a fully resurrected body,
Yeah.
strong, vibrant, and he's holding himself to the cross. He's not nailed to it. And the cross and he are ascending into heaven. He's bringing his cross to heaven with him.
Mm.
And, you see that the triumph of the cross, that it is possible in this era to come back to that. Another great thing about that painting, by the way, going back to somewhere we started, the big people, little people thing,
Yeah.
is that theme recurs again there, where Dali has painted himself into the painting. It's actually his wife. She's standing as a little person kneeling before this image
Yeah.
of Christ on the hypercube. So we kind of come full circle.
Yeah. Yeah. Being in front of a painting is a different experience, and I'll I think one of the greatest experiences I ever had of really truly understanding the power of a canvas and being in front of a piece of art is with the Starry Night image. I had seen Starry Night a billion times in my life, in
Yeah,
everywhere. And then I stood in front of the painting, and it melted me in a way that was not possible in any other medium. And it was behind glass. I've had the great gift of being very close to some very incredible paintings with nothing between me and that
yeah,
canvas.
yeah.
Six,
Italy.
700-year-old canvases,
Yeah,
yeah. But and seeing the brushstrokes up close and everything, and it's a different experience. So, and I know the book takes us to the power of these images, but you've walked through and you've seen a lot of these up close. And
yeah.
can you talk about like what the work transmits to you, and what your experience is when you experience it in that way?
Yeah, and David, a couple of comments. First of all, it's very interesting that you choose Van Gogh to talk about this because he's such a tactile painter, and there is a real difference with him. Um, a second thing I'd say, and some of my friends in the book field, I'm in New York here, so I have some. When they saw Sophia's um, edition of Pilgrimage to the Museum, they said this was a love note from your publisher. I mean,
Oh yeah.
um, they purposely, and it's obviously the most expensive way you could think of to produce a book. I mean, normally art books have color plates in the center, so you can have sort of, you got to print color photos on glossy paper, right? And it's
Yeah.
expensive. So they put them all in one little section, and you're constantly flipping back and forth. But Sophia wanted to give the experience as much as possible of an actual pilgrimage in the museum. And they chose instead to do it differently, which was the whole book is color imagery. And
Yeah.
paintings are there right as they're being discussed, and you're sort of right in front of them. So I think they did try to recreate that experience for the readers, which I really appreciated. And it wasn't my idea. My humility, frankly, wouldn't have asked them to do that. But there is something really tactile about being in front of the painting, and Van Gogh is such a perfect example of that. You know that we have Starry Night in the book. The
Yes.
other advantage of the book was that, and I use Evelyn as the foil, as I often do with these things, that we made an agreement that we would only have a select number of paintings from outside the Metropolitan Museum when we did the book.
Yeah.
It was a kind of a self-discipline to make sure. I mean, I of course was tempted to include stuff from all over the world, but the thing never would have ended. But if you see a painting in the pilgrimage that's not in the Met, that's probably an asterisk on, boy, he must think this is pretty important to the storyline,
Sure.
And
Yeah.
Starry Night is there because, and I think you were alluding to it, Van Gogh was a guy who really was struggling to find God. And I think he actually started his life as a Methodist minister.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't work out too well. And, everyone knows a lot about Van Gogh. So I think you'll get it that he clearly struggled with personal relationships. His brother Theo was the only person he really got along with. And, I think it kind of comes back to his relationship with God, which for him was a scary force. And I think for a lot of us is. And that's usually the path not to find God, because, in our relationship with Jesus is personal. He cares about us. But for Van Gogh, he was scary. And there's a painting in the book called We Feel with Cypress where this scariness comes through, but I just couldn't help myself but include Starry Night because I think, wasn't that your experience in front of it, that this is kind of scary and beautiful in some ways, but scary in another way? Like God is up there in the sky and it's almost nightmarish.
Yeah. And
Uh,
not only that, you're in front of something that the person who created it has been in contact with. Like, he had his hands on it. He
Yeah.
grabbed that canvas. That
That's tactile.
there's a tactile thing there that
Yeah.
which I later in life really experienced a few times in Florence as well. But it's also that. But yes, it's true that canvas it says so much more, that painting, when you stand in front of it than. But I wasn't in any way saying that takes away from the experience of the book, because it's an amazing volume. But because you've spent so much time in front of paintings, I'm sure at times you've had that experience as well.
Yeah, you get absorbed into them. And, the other one I'm thinking about is Degas, not Degas, but Rodin. You'd say Degas also, but Rodin, in his sculpture, which almost looks like he formed it out of clay.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Rothko as well. I've just sat in front of a Rothko for like 45 minutes. It's just the paintings start to pull you in some way,
Yeah.
and you start to actually see the layers of like what he's actually doing with color, and it's a very particular kind of experiment he's conducting. But for those who have the awareness, they can really pull you in a fascinating way. I guess I want to sort of ask you a little bit about your relationship with doing these tours with your sort of collaborators who we haven't mentioned, which is your wife and a priest that took you through to see these, help you see these paintings in a different perspective. Can we maybe that'll be a nice way for us to close out our conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm smiling here because, Evelyn's my lifelong partner and we do everything together. So when we decided to embark on this, we did. And we go through the museum, and it's sort of, I always kind of laugh to myself as we go through it, because it's a little bit like, I don't know if people get this illusion, but, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And you've got this huge choir standing there on the stage. And people are wondering, what are they doing here? I mean, there's no choirs in symphonies. And you go through, the first movement and normal kind of thing, the second, the third, 10 minutes into the fourth, where are these people? And then suddenly, that baritone stands up and starts in with the Ode to Joy, right? And it's a very dramatic moment. It's kind of like that with the tour, because Evelyn is less interested in the classical art, so I'm kind of taking us through Egypt and Greece and Rome and the early middle. And then we get to this image that Evelyn had insisted I put in the tour early on, called by Lorenzo Monaco, Christ and the Virgin interceding for the sinners. And when I was first taking her through the museum to show her my new idea, she says, "Oh, Steve, we need to include this painting." I go, "Sweetheart, please. I mean, Lorenzo Monaco is like a lesser Renaissance artist. I mean, we don't have time for this kind of stuff, "Oh, but Steve, I really think it's an important painting." I go, "Sweetheart, I'll think about it." So I go back later and look, I'm like, well, she might be onto something here. And her description of the Lorenzo Monaco, which is in the book, along with several other paintings that she and her sidekick, Father Sean, who has been with us on most of the tours. We always bring a priest with us.
Oh, wow.
Father, yeah, we just find it really helps the energy, if nothing else. And his running commentary on what we're saying is always interesting. And Father Sean particularly is a little bit mischievous, and he's kind of fun to be with. But the two of them have collaborated in many cases. Like, I'll be standing there. I won't go through the whole Lorenzo Monaco. We probably don't have time, but make sure you read that if you haven't. And for those of you listening, it's an amazing painting that really has become a pivot point of the entire pilgrimage. and is often, in the unpacking that we always do at dinner after the tour with whoever comes with us. It's almost always in the top three in terms of, which always annoys me,
Yeah.
Evelyn's opinion, but and she's got several others in there that really have become critical to the narrative. So yeah, it's a wonderful thing when your spouse and you do things together with Christ in the center, and maybe Father Sean stands in for that. And there's an energy and a joy to it that wouldn't be there. And she brings a different spirituality than I do. Evelyn is kind of almost a mystic in some ways, and I'm a little more systematic
Yeah.
about my faith. So it's a very nice combination. I think it comes through. People have said to me they can hear her in the pages of Pilgrimage to the Museum, folks that know us.
Oh. Well, it's a wonderful book. The book is The Pilgrimage to the Museum. I've been speaking with its author, Stephen Auth. Stephen, thank you so much for this time that you've given today, and it's just been a very rich and very pleasant conversation.
Thank you, David.
Check us out on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, our website, thefocusingway.com.